With the help of Hashem, we are learning Chagiga Daf Chav Zayin. We will be making the Siyum today. We actually are up to Daf Chavav Amid Aleph, 5 lines before the bottom of the Amid, by the second to last Mishnah of the Amid, the second to last Mishnah of Masechtas Chagiga, the second to last Mishnah of Seder Moyed. And this Mishnah is going to continue to teach us dinim concerning the Tumas Am Haaretz, which is a rabbinic Tumah. Because we are saying that, not that we know that they're Tameh, but that we suspect that they're Tameh, and therefore they are by default Tameh Midrabanan. On the other hand, we also learned that during Yom Tiv, the Chachamim disregarded Tumas Haaretz. And that's very important. The disregarding means it's not that they're not Tameh, but we disregard it. It's not removed. It's not ignored. And after Yom Tiv, we say that limafreya, retroactively, everything that they touched over Yom Tiv will become limafreya, retroactively tamei. And therefore, we're going to learn that all of the movable kalim in the Beis Hamikdash, small ones, large ones, after Yom Tiv, have to be taken to the mikvah because they were touched by the Am Haaretz, with the exception, as we will see, that I'm going a little bit out of order, that the 2 altars, the Mizbeach Hazav, which is the Mizbeach that is inside the sanctuary, what the Mishnah calls here the Mizbeach HaNechoshes, the copper altar. Really, it was a copper altar built by Moshe, built by Betzalel under the leadership of Moshe. But when Shlomo HaMelech built the first Beis Hamikdash, he found that Mizbeach to be too small, and of course everything was with God's word. He built a much larger Mizbeach, as we learned, and we will learn again many pratim of how it evolved. It got from big to bigger to even bigger. Nevertheless, the Mishnah here calls it the copper altar, that the golden altar and the copper altar are b'chlal not susceptible to becoming tamei, and the shulchan, which is susceptible to becoming tamei, was the only klei shadis that we really wanted for it not to be moved. Now, meaning to be toivelt. If you have to toivel it, you have to move it. The reason for that is because there is a pasuk in Truma concerning the shulchan, and it says, "V'nosata ala shulchan lechem apanam lefanai tamid." Now, Chevra, it's good to note that the word tamid is written regarding the menorah. The word tamid doesn't have to mean that something has to be there 24/7. Just for other than Shitas Rambam concerning the menorah was not lit 24/7. We understand the Rambam again stands alone. The menorah was lit towards the evening. As we learned the pratim, we say this every day in the Abaye Hava Masada, say that Hamaracha B'Shmadigam, his tradition of exactly when was the menorah lit at the end versus the Ketaidas versus the Tamid Shel Bein Ha'arbayim. But the menorah was lit towards the evening, and every lamp had the half a loig of oil in it, which was exactly the oil needed, even for the longest winter night, for it to remain burning until the morning. But in the morning it would extinguish itself. Other than the miracle that happened to the Neir Hamaravi, there's a 3-way machlokes Tanoim, which candle was the Neir Hamaravi. But other than the miracle, the menorah was not lit tamid. Tamid can also mean what we're doing. We learn consistently, every day, not the whole day, a little bit, an hour, 2 hours, whatever the time is. That is the meaning of tamid many times. By the Shulchan, we know, Torah Shebal Peh, tamid means tamid. Tamid means continuously, that Hashem wants for the breads, which were really matzah, to be on the shulchan, where they are, which is lifnei Hashem, which is exactly where they were placed in the kodesh, always. Now, if you have to remove the table to take it into the mikvah, even if you would have a replacement table, but still, it's not there. You have to move it out for a moment. That area won't be occupied with the table. So we really don't want to have to toivel the shulchan. So again, if the shulchan becomes tamei, we have to toivel it. But over Yom Tiv, the only caution that we would tell to the kohanim that were considered amaratzim, please don't touch the shulchan, because if you will touch the shulchan, then for this rabbinic tumah, we would have to toivel it, and we don't want to do that. And again, the other kalim we didn't mind. Well, we were, if they, in the ideal world, we would mind if they would touch it. But as we keep on learning, we don't want to create Eva. And if Amoritz will constantly be told, you can't do this, you can't do that, the Kohanim might end up building their own Beis HaMikdash. But the Shulchan is something unique. So bottom line is, the Shulchan we didn't want to move, and the two Mizbachos are not susceptible to becoming Tamei, and we're going to learn a lot about that. Why were they not susceptible? There is actually an approach in the Gemara that this is subject to a Machlekes Tanoim, but the final V'iba Yesema is that everyone agrees to the fact that the two Mizbachos are not Makabel Tumah. There's only a question as to what the reason for it. Why is it not susceptible to becoming Tamei? Now, we're going to learn some more nuanced halachas regarding Tumah and Tara, just to share one more in the final part of our introduction, and that is like this. The Torah in Parsha Shmini, one of the places where we have a record of the Hilchas of Tumah and Tara, there we are actually speaking about one of the 8 Shiratzim, that when they are dead, they impart Tumah, they are Tamei on the level of an Av, and everything that has halachic contact becomes a Rishon. So the Torah speaks about various utensils that might have had contact with the dead sheretz that becomes Tamei, and the Torah juxtaposes, the Torah mentions clayates, and in the same verse you also have a sack. A sack means a sack, a big bag. Now bags were made for them to be filled up and for you to be able to transport items from one place to the other. So no matter, they didn't make humongous sacks, they made large sacks. So we have a limud from the smichos that just like a sack was not made super big, it was made in a way that even when it's full you can transport it. The wooden utensil that the Torah also speaks about is only susceptible to becoming Tamei if it's made to be moved, and it actually could be moved even when it's full. Wooden utensils that are made lenachas, nachas means it's made to be stationary, or if it was not made to be stationary, but it's so big that when it's full and you move it, you'll break it. It wasn't made to be moved, it's not susceptible to becoming Tamei. And that's going to be very much connected to this whole question, how can the Shulchan even become Tamei? The Shulchan was not made to be moved. We just quoted the pasuk, Tamid has to be there always. And even though it was coated with gold, but it was a wooden table, as we'll go through Pratim. And that will be the whole question when you have a keli made out of one material, but it's coated with another material. There's a tzipui. How do you qualify that utensil? Does it go after its bones, or does it go after its coating? And we're going to have actually a rule with the big exception and many other pratim. There's going to be a beautiful agadic ending about Talmidei Chachamim that they will never be affected by the fire of Gehenim. And Eshlakish, the great Baal Tshuva, says not only a Talmud Chacham, he says that even a Poishe Yisrael can never be affected by the fires of Gehenim. Obviously, he's not telling people, don't be afraid, go out and sin, but he's telling you a fact, that the fact that we are Yidden, and as we'll see again, the Rebbe connects it to the inner Jew, to the outer Jew, the inner wood, the outer coating, what is Koiveya de Keli, the inner or the outer, and as we'll share a few words inside, if we'll have time, from the Kutesichas Chelik Tezayin, the Rebbe Siyum, from his many Siyumim, Amesechtas Chagiga. All right, enough of the intro. Yes?
We learned that Shlomo HaMelech added...
Oh, very good. So Shlomo HaMelech clearly added 10 Shulchanis and 10 Menorahs. Right. Nevertheless, all of them needed to be there. In other words, if God wanted for there to be one, as Hashem wanted in the Mishkan, and as happened in the second Beis HaMikdash. And during the first Beis HaMikdash, we learned the Machlokes, Danny, how were these Shulchanos positioned? Were they positioned north-south? Were they positioned east-west? Whatever that is, they all needed to be their Tamid. So if they have to all be their Tamid, we don't want any of them to become Tamid. But again, if Tumah touched them, then we have to take it to the mikvah. But the other kalim, we didn't mind to take them to the mikvah. They didn't have to be where they were placed, tamid. Okay, Chavra, let's go. Again, Daf Chavav, Amid Aleph. We have 5 lines before the bottom of the Amid. Second to last Mishnah, says the Mishnah. Misha Avad HaRegel. Based on what we learned, that during the Regel, Chachamim suspend Tumas HaMa'aretz. But it's only suspended, it's not removed. So after the Yom Tov goes by, says the Mishnah, Ma'avirin, we remove Al Taharas or Azara, we remove to purify the courtyard. Mishnah, Rebbe, There's a reason why he wrote it this way, but what it means is they removed all of the utensils and they took them to the mikvah. Now guys, we're not familiar with taking kalim to a mikvah, but it's Mashiach is coming, it's going to be very common. A bed that a nida sat on has to be taken to the mikvah. No, it's kalim will be going to, including the mattress. We'll get used to it. Now, again, there are certain materials that cannot be toiveled in the mikvah, which is earthenware kalim, and there are certain utensils that don't become tummy to begin with. Like, for example, any utensil that's made out of stone, not susceptible to becoming tummy. Any keli that's made out of earth, I'm not talking about ceramic. Ceramic is earth that was burnt, fired up in a kiln. That becomes susceptible with the nuances. It can only become tummy if the tumah entered the inside of it, not the outside of it. Earth doesn't become tummy. They used to make kalim from dung, the Mishnah speaks about. Cannot become tummy. But the kalim that could become tummy have to go to the mikvah. So all of the kalim, now the little kalim is no problem. So you had golden cutlery and stuff like that. If they had golden cutlery, that would go to the mikvah. But that would also include the big kalim that we are familiar with. Like we'll see the menorah. Here are the exceptions. That if Yom Tov ended on Thursday, not on Friday. On Thursday, which means Friday is the day after Yom Tov. The day after Yom Tov, right, would be normally the day that everything is taken to the mikvah, but Erev Shabbos, everyone has to get ready for Shabbos in their personal life, including the Kohanim that are working in that Beis Av. So we can't demand for the Kohanim that are there in service to take all the kalim to the mikvah because you're not allowing them to get ready for Shabbos. So then they would delay this going to the mikvah to Sunday. This is Kavod Shabbos personally. Rabbi Yehuda adds another. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Aflei b'Yom Hei. Even if the last day of Yom Tov is on Wednesday, Yom Hei means on Thursday is the day after Yom Tov. Now, what Rabbi Yehuda is focusing on is that there was like a paradox. We didn't want for the Beis HaMikdash to be spotless clean the whole time. We wanted for the Beis HaMikdash to have the appearance that it's being a home that people are living in. God is living in it. And that includes when they used to clean the floor of the Azara. It wasn't after every carbon they cleaned it up. When it got unbearably dirty, then they would open up the water as we learned the system and they cleared it out. The Mizbeach creates ash. We considered it a beauty for the altar for there to be a lot of ash on it. We call that ash the tapuach, an apple. And the bigger the tapuach, wow, you see, we're using the Beis HaMikdash, people are bringing karbanis. Now, there comes a point you have to clear it out. Now, Chavra, don't get confused with the mitzvah that we have in the beginning of Tzav, that every morning we learned the Siyum, that there was Trumas Hadeshin. Trumas Hadeshin simply meant that there was one shovel that was removed every day, and it was placed near the ramp, and miraculously we learned how it got swallowed in that tile, v'chulei. But we're speaking about now Hoitza'as Hadeshin, which is completely removing the ashes. That's something that they did only from time to time. After Yom Tov, they needed to do Hoitza'as Hadeshin. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says, if you're going to make them, they have to do Hoitza'as Hadeshin right after Yom Tov. They won't have time, and it took up that many kohanim. So they won't have time to toivel the kalim. So again, when will they do it? Not Thursday, Friday. Friday Kavod Shabbos. So he just added another day where we delay this obligation, this rabbinic obligation to toivel the kalim, if Yom Tov finished on Wednesday and Isru Chag is on Thursday. Aflei b'Yom Hei, because she'ein ha'kohanim penuyim. Why are they not penuyim? Why can't they take all the kalim Thursday? They're not busy personally Kavod Shabbos. So we learned in a Braisa, second to last line, she'ein ha'kohanim penuyim, because of milahoitzi badeshem, because they are busy removing the ashes. Okay, we're good. Right. Now the final Mishnah. Final Mishnah, Keitzad Mavirim al Taharas Azara. Keitzad Mavirim doesn't mean how they did it, even though that would be the normal translation. Here, Keitzad Mavirim means which kalim needed to be taken to the mikveh. Says the Mishnah, all of them. Madbilim esa kalim shahoyu b'mikdash. All of the kalim. And v'oimrim lahem, and therefore, since all the kalim, with the exception of both mizbeachs, with that exception, since all of the kalim, if we know they had contact with tumah, have to be taken to the mikvah, so we would tell them, meaning the kohanim that were chavedim, we're telling the Kohanim that we're not yet Chaverim. He's Oharu. Please be careful over Yom Tov. Daf Chavav Amid Beis. Shaloi Tigu Bashulchan. Don't touch the table. And Chaver, it's important to remember. If we know the Shulchan became Tamei, it has to be taken to the mikveh. If the Kohanim Amaratzim touched the Shulchan, we would also have to take the Shulchan into the mikveh. Because of this din that Tumas HaMa'aretz, even though it's suspended, but like we mentioned, after Yom Tov, Lim Mafreya, everything has to be taken to the mikveh. What we do for the Shulchan is, since we really don't want to have to move the Shulchan, we tell the Kohanim, don't touch the Shulchan. And we can rely on the fact that unless you know otherwise, they listen to that. And this is the psychology with the Ha'aretz. You never made the Ha'aretz feel that he's out, because he's not out. So if you come with one law, just be careful, don't touch the Shulchan, then we were confident, unless we know otherwise that the Shulchan was not touched, and therefore doesn't need to go to the mikveh.
They don't have a second replacement Shulchan?
So they had another replacement, but when you remove something for a moment, it's not there. And we learned about how did they change the panim breads. There you also have the Shulchan, so we learned the machlokes. One shita is that they would have Kohanim on this side, Kohanim on that side. And then as they would put on the new, the old would go off. So the question is, could they do that with the Shulchan? Probably not as accurately as they did it with the breads. And don't forget, by the breads you don't have an option. You have to remove it. Here you have an option. Make sure it doesn't become tummy. Make sure it doesn't become tummy. So they made an effort only for the Shulchan. Now, we're worrying about Kohanim because Yisrael may not enter the Heichal. Even though Kohanim are not bound to Ezras Yisrael, we spoke about the Salat. There was the first 11 Amos was Ezras Yisrael. And then there was Ezras Kohanim. There was another 11 Amos before the Mizbeach. Because of the Kachim having to be slaughtered, B'tzfain, B'tzafin. And we have again a three-way machlikas where the Tzafin is. But if the Tzafin HaMizbeach means mamish to the north of the altar, not more to the east, whoever's familiar with that sugya, based on Tekev, Lasmicha, Shchita, so a Yisrael, according to many Tanoim, would enter Ezras Kohanim to do smicha on his animal. So just to be aware of that Ezras Kohanim doesn't mean that Yisraelim were not allowed to enter there. It just means that they only entered there if there was a need. But going beyond the altar, Bein Ulam Lamizbeach, Yisrael had no business there ever. And Yisrael was not allowed to enter the Kodesh, ever. So correct, this is for Kohanim Amaratzim. Says the Mishnah, top line, Kol HaKelim Shoyev HaMikdash. All of the Kelim that were in the Mikdash, since again, all of them, if they become Tamei, have to be toivelt, including this rabbinic Tvila after Yom Tov, Yesh Lahem Shniyim Ushlishim. They had replacement sets. How many replacement sets? Not only one, Shni means even a third one. They needed to think that far ahead, because it's possible by the time you take it to the mikvah, the current one became Tamei. Now you can argue Ein Lo Davar Soif. That was, by the way, the beginning of Yuma. How many replacement Kohen Gadol do you need? So having one is one thing. Saying you have to have two, the Gemara Ein Lo Davar Soif. For the Kalim, they had two replacements, second and a third, with the presumption that we're not going. Once the last one is over there, we're really going to make efforts to make sure it doesn't become Tamei. If any of the first becomes Tamei, and you have to add the word etc., because the Rebbe just said that you also have Shlishim. And now we're going back not only to the general if it became Tamei, but going back to our topic that after Yom Tov, because of the fact that we never excluded Kohanim Amaratzim, Adarabah, we said we suspend Tumas HaMa'aretz. So Kohanim, whether they were Chaverim or Amaratzim, they worked in the Beis HaMikdash. So the presumption is they touched everything. So all of the Kelim have to be taken to the mikveh. Chutz mizbach hazav, aside of the golden mizbeach, which we can also call the inner altar, the altar upon which they offered the ketores daily, the mizbeach upon some karbanos, blood was sprinkled on top of the mizbeach hazav, with Yom Kippur and other unique karbanos, and the mizbach hanachoshes and the copper altar. Copper altar means the outer altar. Kodim kol when Moshe Rabbeinu built the Mishkan, it was a copper altar. Yesh oiminim that when Mashiach is coming, we're going to go back to the copper altar. And guys, we learned this in Seder Kachim. The copper altar was very small. There's a machlikas tanoim also. How big was it? If you read the pasuk, it sounds like it was very small. We take the pasuk out of the pshat over there, almost. even though ein mikri yitzim midei pshuta, there's really one official exception, and there are many other exceptions, what we would call an exception. And there was 1 amma by 1 amma space to burn the karbanos. Can you imagine? I don't get the picture, but okay, one amma by 1 amma, if you look on the tiles before we put the beautiful floors over here, it was 18 inches or 19 inches by 19 inches. You know how many karbanos were brought every day? Crazy amounts of karbanos. Shlomo HaMelech, by the way, the day that he inaugurated the first Beis HaMikdash, now he already made a bigger altar. He brought himself, I think, 120, 130,000 karbanos, just King Solomon. So how do you have all these animals being burnt in that place? And the answer is because it was a miraculous fire. Even though mitzvah lo havim min ha'hedrit, you had to bring every day the two eitzim. We say this again, and Abba you have a mesaded, but there was a heavenly fire that looked like a lion that would consume the karbanos, and it didn't need to have that much space. And when Mashiach is coming, many people hold that the Mizbeach will be copper. That's why Rebbe writes Mizbeach HaNachoshes. Many people say that no, that it refers to the outer altar. It's not so pasha. The outer altar cannot become tamei during the times of the Mishnah, which is, let's go, even in the times of the second Beis HaMikdash, because it was made out of stone. Remember, we learned how they made it. They had a mold, and it was made out of stone. It wasn't one block of stone, but it was stone and cement. Stone and cement are not makabel tuma, b'chalal. Ein achanami. Oh, so then, very good. So if you remember, we learned in Zvachim, and Machloikis, there's one opinion that says that even the Mizbeach that was made in the first and second temple, that was made out of that mold with stones, with smooth stones and cement, it was coated with copper. And if that would be the case, that would be one of the rayas to that opinion. Because why would Rebbe call it copper? When he wrote the Mishnah, it wasn't made out of copper. And the counter is that maybe then it was not coated with copper, it was takame, it was coated with lime, and it was stone, and it's not my kabel tuma. Rebbe wrote Mizbeach HaNachoshes for Mashiach. When Mashiach is coming, many people hold that we're going to go back to the altar of Moshe Rabbeinu. Wachal, there's a rule that Moshe Nitzchim Heim, or Moshe Yedei Moshe Nitzchim Heim, which means that all of the parts of the Mishkan were nignaz. As we started to incorporate more building and less Mishkan, it was hidden, and it was not hidden for nothing. That means it's going to be incorporated in the third Beis HaMikdash. So logic would be that when the Mashiach will come, we're going to incorporate the kalim that was made by Moshe. And we're back to a copper altar. Copper altar, says the Mishnah, since they are kekarka, and as the Gemara will quote a pasuk. The pasuk is in Yisroi. Right after the 10 Commandments, it says, Mizbach Adoma Tasali. Now, Mizbach Adama, again, what does it mean, Mizbach Adama? In the Mishkan, there was no Mizbach Adama. There's so many answers to that, but we're going to learn the Chazal over here that we compare the copper altar to Mizbach Adama. There is another pasuk that juxtaposes both altars together. It says, V'hamizbachos, and it's called Adama. Adama means earth. There's a rule, like we mentioned, that earth is B'chlal not Mekabel Tumah. If it's fired in a kiln and it becomes cheres, then it's Mekabel Tumah if the Tumah enters from the inside. And earthen keli, if you take earth and you just harden it, and you don't use it for something hot, but you use it for whatever, it's not B'chlal Mekabel Tumah. So since the Torah calls it Adama, therefore halachically it has the status of a Kilei Adama, and therefore it's not Mekabel Tumah. So it never has to be taken to the mikveh, even if you know that a source of Tumah touched it. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer, and the Chachamim, again, apparently agree, and that will be the final answer. They agree, but they give another reason. They say the reason why it doesn't have to be taken to the mikvah, the reason why it's not even susceptible to becoming tamei, because it is mitzup and it's plated. It's plated with gold, it's plated with copper, which is a big problem, because as we'll learn soon, that other than the exceptions, if you have an item that's plated, the status halachically concerning tumah and tara is after its plating. It's after its chitzonius, as we'll see. And gold and copper is a metal, and we'll see actually that metal is more susceptible than wood. The heter that we spoke on in the intro, that a clay eitz, ha'asoi linachas, is not mekabel tumah, because we said the pasuk in Shemini, the Torah juxtaposes clay eitz and sak. That verse mentions other items, but it doesn't mention metal. So metal, even if it's a huge metal keli that's meant to be stationary, that cannot be moved, even if it's empty, is still susceptible to becoming tummy.
It has to be a keli.
This is called a keli. This is called, in this context, it's called a keli. So actually, mitzupim is not a reason to say why it's not tamei. Mitzupim should be a reason that even if it's actually made out of earth, and by the way, in the Mishkan, according to Rashi, nevuv lucha is that the nechoshes mizbeach in the Mishkan was hollowed from the inside. And you need it for the sand of the desert to fill up the inside. It means when the Levium would move the mizbeach, you would see like this mold in the sand. It was actually, so it was Adama. That's one of the pshatim. We learned this together. Why does the Torah call it Adama? Now we're learning a drasha. Adama, to tell you it's not Makabal Tumah according to Rabbi Eliezer. But you go after the plating. So this last line will have to be explained. And actually there is one approach that Chachamim argue with Rabbi Eliezer, but then we'll learn the other approach, the Iba is same. Okay. Says the Gemara. Tana we learned in a Brais that even though our Mishnah mentioned that the only keli that we told the Kohanim Amaratzim, please don't touch over Yantiv, was the Shulchan, because the Torah uses the words Tamid, we learned in the Braisa that it was actually also the Menorah, because the Torah also uses the word Tamid, as we all know from the Maimer Va'ata Tetzava. But we also know from the Maimer that there's really a stira. In the first pasuk it says Tamid, and the next pasuk it says Me'erev Ad Boker. And that's Taka the Machloikis. The Rambam, who stands alone, like he does many times, holds that the menorah was lit at night and in the morning. We don't follow that. Or everyone else says the menorah was only lit every evening, before it got dark, not like Hanukkah. So the Tamid means every day consistently, but not the whole day. But the Torah says the words Tamid. So, Hizoharu Shematigo Bashulchan Uba Menorah. Same concept. They never wanted to move the menorah either. So they would tell the Kohanim over Yom Tov, please don't touch not the Shulchan nor the Menorah. They all had backups because it's important. We didn't want to move it, but if it became Tameh, you have to take it to the mikveh.
Where were the backups stored?
Where were the backups stored? The temple was a huge compound. And they had all these tuz. If you remember the tuz, Taf Aleph, all over the place. 3-story tuz inside the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. So says the Gemara, V'tana didan mai tama loy tani menorah. So the Gemara answers, because by Shulchan, Ksiv Beit Tamid, meaning the word Tamid by Shulchan means 24/7, the bread and the table should be in front of me always. By Menorah, you don't have the word Tamid. No one debates that. Even though open up a Chumash, you'll see the word Tamid by the Menorah, but we know the word Tamid by Menorah doesn't mean continuously. They say Ner Tamid. Many shuls have a minute, they have a Ner Tamid. Just to know, the Menorah's Tamid doesn't mean continuously. Even according to the Rambam, the candles went out, other than the miracle of the Ner Hamaravi. Then it was rekindled in the morning. Then it was rekindled in the evening. Okay. The Idach, Kivan the Chsiv, the Braisa holds, you're right, the word Tamid by Menorah doesn't mean continuously. But since it says that the Es HaMenorah should be placed Noichach HaShulchan, literally, it means it should be placed on the opposite side. Right, the Shulchan was in the north. Haroitza lahashir yatzpin shkoyach. Haroitza lahachkim yadrim. But it was one opposite the other. So command chsiv but tamid dami. Here you go. We have a good picture here with the Lubavitch, but the Rebbe is not a good picture. The Menorah has to be corrected. The idach. It's okay. He's trying. The idach hahulik vaya. I know that it says V'es HaMenorah Noichach HaShulchan, but Noichach HaShulchan doesn't mean that it has to be continuously there. All it means is to know where do you place it, and there's so many details. If you remember that the Heichel itself, all of the Kalim were placed. If you're gonna see, it was 20 amas long, and then it was 40 amas long, the Kodesh, and then the Kodesh HaKachim was another 20. It's a total of 60. We had that stira. One place it says the Kalim were placed in the inner, in third. One place it says it was placed in the middle. And the answer is, if you count all the 60 together, then the Kalim were placed after a third. The third was empty. If you're only viewing at the Kodesh itself, so then the Kodesh room was divided into two. The half closest to the outside was empty. And then right on the boundary, which is 20 amas in, they put in the center the Mizbach Hazov, which was not in between. And then beyond that, they had the Shulchan and the Menorah. Or again, yeah, you're right, Shlomo Melech added another 10 and 10. Now, the Teipur Clay asks the Gemara, let's go back to our Mishnah. Why do we have to tell the Kohanim, be careful? Why are we concerned? Maybe they touched it, and if they touched it, and I'll tell you better, not Amoritz. If I know that a real Tumah, a Tumah Doiraisa touched it, why should it become Tamei? Now, I know everyone thinks about the gold. Yeah, it's gold, but it's not gold. It's a wooden cliche. It's Atzei Shittim. It was coated with gold. It was plated with gold, but it's considered l'chayra wooden utensil. So asks the Gemara, v'teipu clay, the clay eitz ha'asei l'nachasu, that this is considered this is a wooden utensil that was made to be stationary. It was made to be stationary because God says the word tamid. And we have a rule that what? The chol kli eitz, which is made to be stationary, does not become tamei, even if you know that a biblical source of tumah had contact with it. And what's the reason for that rule? Because dumya the sak bo'inan. So here's where Rashi quotes the pasuk in Shmini. It's about shedetz, but it's about any source of tumah. The pasuk writes that koila sheyipar all of mehem b'moisam yitma. Any one of the 8 dead shiratzim, if they die, they impart tumah. What will they impart tumah to? Says the verse, b'kol kliates, to any wooden utensil, beged, garment. Garment, you should know, means either linen or wool, oy oid or leather, oy sak or sack. And there's a limit for each one. Now, by the way, this doesn't mean that these are the only materials that are makabel tuma. Metal is makabel tuma. And even more, like we said, metal is not mentioned here. So this limitation, which is a leniency, that if it's so big that it's not movable or it was made to be stationary, it's not even susceptible to becoming tamei, that qualification is not given to metal. So a golden utensil, a copper utensil, a silver, a metal utensil could be huge, could be made to be stationary, and it will be mekabel tumah. Okay. Because my tama dumi the sack inan. What do we learn? What does Chazal say? What do we learn from the sack? Masak metaltal malivedeka. The sack is meant to fill it up with things, to transport it. Why do you have a sack? It's like a packing box. Afkol, any material, as long as it's made to be moved and it's movable, even when it's full, like it can be moved when it's empty. That means if you have a keli, we go into the Siyum, Rashi mentions that a keli that is 40, that is able to be machzik 40 saw of water and 2 koid of dry, because dry you can pile on top. We had all these Siyurim. So that's a size that even if it was made to be transported, but when it's full, unless you make it super strong, when you'll move the keli, you might break the keli. So any wooden keli that is that size or larger is not susceptible to becoming tamei. Any wooden keli that's smaller, but it was made to be stationary, is not susceptible. So what's the issue? Why are we afraid that the shulchan, let the kohanim amaratzim touch the shulchan? So the Gemara says, no, I'll tell you why. Because the shulchan was made to be moved. Who told you the shulchan was made to be stationary? It says lefanai tamid, but there was a time that they dafka needed to move it. So here we start going to exceptions. And by the way, if it became tamid, we also moved it. So don't jump with the tamid. But we try other than when you have to not to move it. When did we move it? Hainami answers the Gemara, we moved the menorah. Not only do we move it when it's empty, the shulchan was never empty. We move the shulchan even when it's filled with when it's laden with the panim breads. Kidei shlakish, the amar shlakish, my dechsiv. What's the meaning of the pasuk in Parshas Emor? Emoy al hashulchan atoir. Why did the Torah have to write the word toir if there is a rule, which there is a rule, that kleyates ha'aseh linachas is always tar? So why did the Torah have to write on the Shulchan Toid? From there we learned that it could become Tamei. Why can it become Tamei? And the rule should be Ve'ena Makabel Tuma. The answer is because the Shulchan was lechatchila made for it to be moved 3 times a year. They moved it. The machlekes here is, where did they move it to? Let's read it inside. Ela Malamed, that over Yom Tov they would lift it. Now, some opinions hold that they wouldn't only lift it, they would take it out of the Heichal. There are other Rishonim that say that they never took the Shulchan out of the Heichal. But like we mentioned, the Shulchan is within the second half of the Heichal. And the Yisraelim that are out in Ezras Yisrael, and then in Ezras Nashim, aside of the fact that you're looking up, because as you went up there were steps, as we learned many times. But they moved it so close to the opening that people outside were able to see. And what would they see? Umarin boy, it would be shown lo oiler golem to all of the Yidden that were in the Zara. What would they be shown? The lechem upon him, and v'oimnim lahem, and we, whoever would do this, the kohanim would announce, Ru'uchi baschem lifnei hamokim. Look how God loves you. How did we see that God loves us? That silukai kisidurei. That when we removed the breads, they were just as hot as they were when they were placed. Now, there's so much into this, but let's move on. Just to know, the breads were not baked and placed, for the record. When would the breads be baked? Remember? Friday. When would they be placed? Shabbos. That was the whole din, and we learned that there was the marble table, and then there was maybe a silver table, and there was a golden table. We all learned this together in this cycle already. But they used to bake the breads. Doesn't justify Chilul Shabbos. They would break it on Friday. They would place it on Shabbos, prior to which it would be either on a marble table or on a silver table. Not on a gold, because you want to go Mailan Bakoidish. Then they would remove it on Shabbos. That's when they would replace it. It remained smoking hot, not only for the 24 hours prior to putting it on, but a week later when they removed it, it was mamish smoking, as if it was just removed from the oven. And very similar, we mentioned that just like in the Kodesh HaKodshim, in Mokim, that Mokim ha'adon enim in Amida, and as we also learned now in Chagiga, the concept that time and space is really the same thing. So just like in the Holy, when you're close to God, space doesn't take up space, time doesn't take up time. Which is how the Rebbe links the Neir Hamaravi never went out. Why didn't it go out? Because time didn't take up time. When you light a candle right now, before time goes by, it's going to burn. Why should it go out? Because as time goes by, it's consuming more oil. If you are Lamayla Mahazman, it doesn't get consumed. So just like that happened with the menorah, makes sense. And we just said that one should be opposite the other. So the same expression of Lamayla Mahazman, why should it not be smoking hot? Because time went on, time didn't take up time. That kisidure kachsi lukai. And Shenemer, as it says, now here you have to know how to read a pasuk in Nach. It says in Shmuel, Lasum, let me tell you how it's read, the pshat. Lasum lechem chaim, put on hot bread on the same day that you remove the old bread. That's the pshat. How does he darshan it? Instead of putting the comma after the word chaim, put the comma before the word chaim. Lasum lechem. Every week they put on bread. And then we add chaim b'yom elokchai. The old bread was still hot when you removed it. And we wanted for us to see the miracle. Okay. So now it's good. Now we get why the clay eitz ha'asel l'nachas doesn't pose a problem. It's not a problem because it was not meant l'nachas. It's taka considered eitz. It's taka considered eitz. Makabel tuma. It's not asel l'nachas. So if it becomes tummy, you got to toivel it. Another problem, asks the Gemara, why did you have to come to this fact that it was made to be moved? Why didn't you give a better answer? What would be the better answer? Let's and let me tell you the problem with this answer. Is it considered the table was meant to be moved? You can argue the table was meant to stay in one place. God says the word tamid. Well, the fact that 3 times a year, that's an exception. They moved it to show a miracle. And let me ask you another question. Bisman Bayesheni, we learned in Yuma many miracles between Shimon HaTzadik and the last 40 years, and especially during the last 40 years of Bayesheni, there weren't many miracles. Maybe the miracle didn't happen then. And if the miracle didn't happen, then I think we learned Befedish it didn't happen, then they wouldn't lift it. In other words, you can counter-argue, that's not a real answer. The Shulchan was made to be stationary. Why didn't you give a better answer? You know what the better answer is? Like we just mentioned, the limud that a keli that's made to be stationary is not Mekabel Tuma, is only clay eitz, not metal, not mateches. Metals include silver and gold and copper. Why didn't we say better? That since the table was coated in gold, and as we will see, it gets the halachic quality of its covering. You don't look at the inner, you look at the outer. So it's not clay eitz, it's a clay mateches. That should be a much better answer. Frek the Gemara, that v'teipu kli mishum tzipui. It's susceptible because it's coated with gold, and gold is considered a metal. A metal is not in the same verse where God speaks about the sack. So you don't juxtapose it. As we learned in Masechtas Kelim, listen to this. We want to prove from this Mishnah that everything follows the coating. We'll see soon exceptions by the Mizbeach, but now we're learning about over here the Shulchan. V'hashulchan, a wooden table. V'hadulpaki, dulpaki is some sort of wooden folding chair. These are kelim that are makabel tuma. They're meant to be moved. Tables are meant to be moved. Not the, there are exceptions to everything, but generally tables are meant to be moved. These folding chairs by default are certainly meant to be moved. What happens if shenif chasu? What happens if they broke? So some of it is missing, but some of it is there. Or if it was covered with marble, now marble is stone. That's from where we see that it follows the coating. Now, there comes a point where the keli is not serving its designated purpose, so it's no longer a keli. So at that point do we say, now that it's broken, it cannot become tummy? From what point do we say, since it's coated with stone, marble, and we know that we followed the coating, we followed the tzipui, it's no longer considered a keli that's susceptible to being mekabel tumah because it's a clay evan. Says the Mishnah, if there is enough wood that's not covered with marble, or if it broke, there is enough wood upon which you can put cups of wine, then it's still considered tummy. Doesn't mean it's tummy. Tummy means it's still susceptible to becoming tummy. Rabbi Yehuda adds, it's not enough for you to have just enough place to put cups. You have to have farbaisen also. There has to be enough place for you to be able to put cups and some food. Also, bottom line is, and if there isn't that space, let's not focus on the broken case. Let's focus on covered with stone. Then it becomes not a wooden shulchan, it becomes a stone shulchan.
What's the minimum size of the cake?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Is that what they're considering right now?
Yeah. We have to. I don't know. So Kevin is asking practically, what does that mean? And also, it says it b'lashon nabim, right? Koisois. So, what does that mean? Does it mean 5 inches, 10 inches? I don't know. But the concept, you see from over here that if there isn't place to put koisois, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, also some farbaisen, some food, pieces of meat or herring, then it's considered a shayish table, and it's not susceptible. And if you're going to counter-argue, well, when do we qualify the keli based on its coating or plating? That depends what the inner part is made out of. Maybe if the inner part is less chashuv, it's bottled to the outer part. Maybe if the inner part is considered more important, then it's not bottled. And we'll see that it's not so. That the table that we made, Moshe Rabbeinu made, that Shlomo HaMelech made, the Torah says it's wood. We're focusing on the shulchan. Atzei shitim, maybe that's considered chashuv. And v'loi batli, well, that will be only a good answer according to Rabbi Resh Lakish. That Resh Lakish Taka says that loi shanu, that the keli is qualified by its outer plating, not by its inner material, only ela b'klei, and he's giving examples of cheap wood. It's interesting, I know in Brazil, anything that's imported is considered chashuv. That's maybe because the Brazilians have no self-esteem. Importado. Here it's the opposite. The imported wood was considered shmata. And at Yisrael, the local wood was considered chashuv. So when do we say that it's batel, ela b'klei, however you pronounce this word, siligin, that haboim medinas hayam, the ones that come from out of Israel, that's cheap. The Eretz Ha'amim, the Goyish wood. So that's batel. Gold. Ava b'chlei masmim. Chlei masmim was made out of local Israeli wood. Masmim is a certain type of wood. Chlei masmim loy batli. So then you can answer that the reason why we needed to come onto the fact that the clay eitz was made to be moved, without that reason, it would not be mekabel tuma. Why? Because it would say lena'ai, it's coated with gold. Atzei shitim is not batel, according to Resh Lakish, which is great because Resh Lakish is the Baal Tshuva. So the Baal Tshuva knows that even when the outer yid is not behaving yet properly, the inner yid is good, not bottled to the outer. Rabbi Yechanan is the tzaddik. The outer is always good. He doesn't have a problem with the outer being dominant. That's a charedi, you are what you look like. Even if the wood is chashuv, the rule is that you qualify the keli regarding laws of tum and tara based on the coating, based on the plating, based on the tzipui. Nami batli ma'ikal meimar. And if you're going to try to answer, well, even you can only qualify it if the plating is properly affixed to the keli. Like if it's glued together, if it's nailed together, maybe. And maybe the gold that plated the shulchan was not nailed on. Also, we say there's no difference. If you're going to answer Avachitema Kan, here Masechtas Kalim, that clearly is saying that the table coated with shayish is considered a shayish, a stone table. It's only b'tzipui oimed. Oimed means it's a coating that will stand. It stands because it's anchored, because either with glue or with a nail. And maybe here, our Mishnah, and maybe the Shulchan, b'tzipui she'ena oimed, they put gold, but it wasn't glued on. So if it's not glued on, then you can't qualify the keli by the coating if it's easy or relatively easier to remove it. So the Gemara says that's not true. Don't forget, this question is only on Rabbi Yechanan. Rabbi Yechanan explicitly disagreed with that, does not accept that difference. The question was asked, do we differentiate between tzipui oimed, tzipui she'ena oimed? He asked another question. When you say that a keli is qualified by its coating, what happens if you coat the keli, you have a table, and you put gold, but the gold doesn't go on its rim. There's a certain part of the inner that remains exposed. Only the rim. Maybe now it's different. And Rabbi Yechanan Lakish asked that. Or another question, do we say that when do we qualify the keli only by the tzipui? Is it b'choifa es leviz bizov? If the coating also covers the rim, do we say that the keli is classified by its coating, even b'she'ener chayfes leviz bizov? And v'amalei, into which Rabbi Yechanan responded, loishna b'tzipui yoimid, loishna b'tzipui she'ein yoimid, loishna b'chayfes leviz bizov, v'loishna b'ein chayfes leviz bizov. Rabbi Yechanan is of the opinion that you follow the coating, you follow the tzipui. So you get the question. Look, we're not arguing with the din. We know that the shulchan could become tummy. But we had a kasha. How can the shulchan b'chal become tamei? Isn't it a wooden utensil made to be stationary? So the answer the Gemara gave was, because they used to show the miracle 3 times a year. We don't like that answer. Why don't we give a better answer? Say because it's not wooden. You see from the Mishnah and Kalim that it should be classified as a metal utensil, as gold is metal, in the context of Tumentara. Yeah. Answers the Gemara, Elo. Shani Shulchan, Daf Chav Zayin, Shulchan is the exception. Since the Torah calls it wood, where does the Torah call it wood? Not in the 5 books of Moses, but in Yecheskel. Now Yecheskel, again, in Chagiga, we were focusing a bit prior on the vision of the Merkava. In Yecheskel, aside of the Merkava, he also saw the 3rd Beis HaMikdash. And he describes what he saw. And he says, HaMizbeach eitz. When you read Mizbeach Eitz, what would you understand? He saw the altar. He did not see the altar. This verse, the pshat, is not the altar. Look at the dimensions. It says that it was 3 amas tall. Let's stop over here. How tall was the Mizbeach? So I know the pasuk in Chumash, but we're going to go, I think it was Vashitas Rabbi Yehuda. The height was 10 amas. With the keren, with the horns, it was 10 amas. So it was 3 amas tall, and the length was 2 amas. That even according to any shita, it wasn't this dimension. In other words, this verse, even though it says HaMizbeach, you know what Yecheskel is talking about? The Shulchan. Now, why would they record the image of the Shulchan with the word Mizbeach? We'll have an agadat, we'll have a good insight in a moment. But HaMizbeach eitz, that's the key. It's called wood. Shalosh amas gavoya, v'arkoi shtayim amas. And then it says umiktsoy oisav, and its corners, loy, v'arkoi v'kiroisav, and its length, and the walls are all made out of wood. And Vaydaber Eli, the Malach, after showing me this vision, told me, Zeh ha-shulchan asher lifnei Hashem. We know it's the shulchan. You see, it's the shulchan. And what is it called? It's called eitz. So the rule is, if you have a utensil made out of one material, but then it's covered, coated, mitzupa, with another, the classification is by its coating. Look at the cover, don't look at the book. The Mizbeach is the exception. So therefore, since it is considered an eitz, if not for the answer the Gemara gave, that they used to lift the shulchan to show the miracle 3 times a year, whenever the miracle happened, if not for that, you take a have a kasha. It should be klei eitz, ha'asil enachas. So we couldn't.
What was that Mizbeach exception? I didn't get
that. The rule is that you qualify a keli based on its outer coating. The Mizbeach, since it's called eitz, we don't do that. We consider it a eitz, a wood utensil. Okay, now that we quoted this verse, we got a problem. Since the pasuk is taka speaking about the mizbeach, and Vayidaber Elai Zeh HaShulchan is speaking about the shulchan, I'm sorry, so why does it begin HaMizbeach? Say HaShulchan. Pasach HaMizbeach v'siyam v'shulchan. So Rabbi Yechanan and Eish Lakish, I'll tell you why. Because prior to the building of the third Beis HaMikdash during Galus, what is our Mizbeach, which brings atonement? Our tables, upon which you do Achnas HaSarchim. The Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin, Gedoyla Legima, that preparing food, again, for visitors is Mekarav de Geula, because it brings the atonement. So we learn Bizman Beis HaMikdash Kayam, when we have a Beis HaMikdash Mizbeach Mechaper Ala Adam. But now that we don't yet, now right before the third Beis HaMikdash, Shulchanai Shel Adam Mechaper Olav. Okay, now the final part of the Mishnah was, that's why in one place throughout the Torah, in Nach, in Yecheskel, do we refer to the Shulchan with the name Mizbeach. Now it says in the Mishnah, really the Gemara, maybe there should be a vav in front of the chule, maybe it's v'chule, because we are focusing on the fact that Rabbi Eliezer says, let's go with Rabbi Eliezer, that both altars cannot become tamei. Cannot become tamei. Now let's follow even what we learned right now. The inner altar was coated with gold. Coated with gold. We say we follow the coating. The outer altar was coated with copper, maybe even during the times of the temples was coated with copper. So it's metal. Metal is Mekabel Tumah. So why is it not Mekabel Tumah? So Rabbi Eliezer says, Mepnei Shehem Kekarka. What does that mean? Why should they be like karka? So says the Gemara, Mizbeach Hanachoishes, or Mizbach Hanachoishes, it says, Mizbach Adama Taseli in Yisrael. So the Torah calls it Adama. So here you see all of a sudden by the Mizbeach, you don't look at the outer, you look at the inner, which is beautiful. Oh. And Mizbach Hazov, since the Torah says in the beginning of Bamidbar, HaMenorah and the Mizbachos, don't even focus on the Menorah. Just the fact that the Torah speaks about both altars in one word, Vaha Mizbachos, so we compare the Mizbeach Hazov to the Mizbeach Hanachoishes. By the Mizbeach Hanachoishes, the Torah calls it once Mizbach Adama, it's called earth. Earth is not Mekabel Tumah. So Rabbi Eliezer learns from this pasuk that the Mizbeach is not Mekabel Tumah. And from the latter one, Iskish, Mizbachai Zelozeh. Now the Chachamim, the ending of the Mishnah is, the Chachamim Oimrim, no, Mepnei Shehem Etzupin. Now that's a problem. Now, we just learned that based on the rule that a keli is qualified halachically concerning Tumah and Tara based on its outer part, and metal is Mekabel Tumah more than wood. Wood, if it's made to be stationary, is not Mekabel Tumah. Flat woodenware is not Mekabel Tumah. Not so by metal. So the wording doesn't make sense. Since they are coated with metals, that's a reason for them to become tamei. So answer number one is Ema. The Chachamim disagree. It's a machloikes. The Chachamim say they are susceptible to becoming tamei. It's called Adama. Who cares? They are coated, and you follow the coating. However, v'iba yisema, now the first wide line, that the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Eliezer. Everyone agrees that both altars cannot become tamei. The question is why? That the Chachamim tell Rabbi Eliezer, my daitech, why do you think? What's the problem? Why do you need to have this verse that you quoted that they're called karka, or as we call they're called adama? Why do you need that verse? Without the verse, it would become tamei. Why would it become tamei? Because of their mitzupin. However, miftil batil tzipuye gabayu. He says no. He says, what did we just learn above? What exception did we have that we don't follow the outer covering? The shulchan. We just learned, and the Torah calls the shulchan and the mizbeach together. That same verse. It's called mizbeach. So just like we use from the top of the Amud, the pasuk in Yecheskel, a exception that the menorah is called eitz. The menorah is coated in gold. By the shulchan. The shulchan is coated in gold. The shulchan is called eitz. By the shulchan you go after the inner. So by the mizbech you should also go after the inner. Here's the exception: miftal batal that tzipuyan, the plating is nullified to the in part. And therefore, what's the in part? Wood, and it's not made to be moved. Klei eitz ha'asui lenachas is not susceptible to becoming tamei. So really, they agree, but they have different reasons why the Mizbeach can never become tamei.
Is this the same Rabbi Eliezer from the story of the Tanakh Balchan, right?
Yeah, this is Rabbi Eliezer Shamuti. Yes, it is. Now, we're going to quote the Rebbe's Vart in a moment. But here we get, this is a very important question. In other words, do you go after the inner, do you go after the outer? Let's go back to the person. As we learn in Chassidus, the outer person is Machshava Divrei U'Maisa. The inner person is, the Moichin and the Midas. The inner is the Neshama. Chelik Elikami Mal Mamish. So, Amar Rabbo, Amar Rabbi Lazar, Da Amoira. Let's first focus on the tzaddik. That now that we said that you go after the inner person when it comes to the Mizbeach, let's go after that when it comes to the Shulchan. Okay, so Talmud Chacham ein oir shel Gehenim sheletzes bahem. A Talmud Chacham, the fire of Gehenim doesn't have any shalita over him. I'm sure my father would say, is Araya, that in Gehenim he'll go. Now, but then he won't be affected, because if he's not even going to Gehenim, of course there's no fire. Ein oir shel Gehenim. Why? We learned this from the Salamandra. Now, salamandra is this magical creature. I know that in English there's a word called the salamander. In camps we used to find the salamander. Salamandra means that if you keep a fire lit for 7 years straight in the same place, after 7 years, a creature will come out of it. And if you take the blood of that creature and you smear it upon you or on anything else, that will be protected from fire. So it says, we have a Kal V'chomer, it makes so much sense, from the Salamandra. Here you go, Kevin found the picture, I don't know if that's the picture. Mistamanat, mi Salamandra. Uma Salamandra. Look inside Rashi. Chaya hanivreis min ha'ur. It's a chaya that is created from fire. It's not created from a yichud of a zachar and a nekeva. Keshavay adam eish b'makim echad sheva shanim tamid b'li hafsek. This Salamandra creature comes out. And it is immune to fire. It's a creature of fire. It's created by fire. Uma Salamandra told us Eichi. It comes from fire. And Hasach midama, a person who smears himself with its blood, ein oir sheletzes boy, a Talmud Chacham, that he's more than a tolda of fire. He is fire. Shekol gufam eish. How is a Talmud Chacham fire? Because it says, regarding the Torah, halakoi devari, ko'esh, God says, my word is like fire. God's word is the Torah. When you are immersed in Torah, you become fire. Alachas kama v'kama, that is a protection from the fire of Gehenim. Amar Reish Lakish, I'll tell you one better. Why do you have to say this only regarding a Talmud Chacham? Again, that's the Hemshech. I'll tell you more. Ein oir or ur shel Gehenim. The fire of Gehenim has no power over even Poishe Yisrael. Even the sinner, the fire will have no effect. And Kal V'chomer mizbach hazav. Let's compare the person to the golden altar. Ma mizbach hazav. Now guys, the altar, the inner altar was made out of wood. How much gold was used to coat the wood? Very little. It had the width of upside a dinner. By the laws of nature, when you start burning things on top of such a keli, even though it's coated with gold, the heat will go through it and it's gonna burn the keli. It never happened. Burn the wood. That mom is be'achazov she'ein olav eloko evi dinar azov. The thickness of the plating was only the thickness of a dinner. Nevertheless, kamoshonim, for all of the years that it was used, ein ha'oid sheletas boy, nothing at all. And Ashi writes that was considered a miracle. A miracle. And look inside the Chevra. Let's learn together the last place was in the Masechta. She'ein boy elo oivi dinar. So in Tanchuma, Itaka writes that Moshe wondered. He asked God, he says, you're telling me to build such an altar, it's going to get burned. They burn the ketairos every day, twice a day. And God told him, listen to this, even though the ketairos, we learned this together, I think it was in Yuma, we got the coals from the outer altar. Doesn't matter, since the outer altar had on it that lion fire, it was considered a miraculous fire. It was a heavenly fire. And God told Moshe Rabbeinu that a heavenly fire only eats up fire. Fire consumes fire, right? The fire of the godly soul eats up the fire of the Yetzer Hara. That it does. But other than fire, it doesn't eat up anything else. And where do we find this from? God told him from the sneh. That the fire didn't burn the sneh. Sneh was made out of wood. The Mizbeach Hazov, how great! That's a comparison. It's all comparison to a yid. So the fire cannot eat it up. Poishe Yisrael. shemelei mitzvahs kenimen, they're not protected with a little oivi dinar of zav. They're filled with mitzvahs. Even the sinner is filled with, like a pomegranate is filled with seeds. As it says, quoting the pasuk in Shir Hashirim, kepelach chorim and rakosech, like a section of a pomegranate are your temples. That's the pshat. The drasha is, don't read the word rakosech, your temples, but ella reikonim shabach, that even the empty ones, we'll leave the last words for the Siyum. We are like the pomegranate. That means we are filled with mitzvahs, so we are protected. Now the Rebbe, we have a moment again. We quoted the Sicha in the beginning of the Masechta. The Rebbe here is connecting the ending and the beginning. So we learned the Machlokes Beishamai and Beisilul regarding the minimum value. Remember, of the Oilas Re'iyah, the Shalmei Chagiga. Which one has to be more expensive? Beishamai, Beisilul. Beishamai held that the Oilas Re'iyah has to be relatively the more expensive one, because it's only for God, so it should be more expensive. The Chagiga we also eat. Beisilul says Adarabba, two achilas, it has to be more expensive. The Rebbe links this in this Sicha in Truma Dalid to the Rebbe went through all of the Sedarim of Mishnayos, and in every say that he brings a machlokes or more between Beishamai and Beisilul, and they are all linked. And I know that many times the Rebbe approached it with B'koyach, B'poyel. It's not a contradiction, it's the same idea coming from another angle. I want to read just a few words here on page 312. Now the Hesber derfun is Beishamai halten. When you say Beishamai, you have to speak in the plural always. Beishamai oimrim in Yiddish halten. As al pi Torah werden in Yonim beikir bestimmt auf in Yesoid von sehr teuchen hakloli wie sie werden genommen beim ersten klolius dicken Blick. It means when you look at something, you have to give us this generic oversight view. And the example, one from the many examples we are familiar, Machlokes Beishamai and Beisilul, Keitz and Meraktam Lifnei Akala. So Beishamai says Kala Kamei Shehi, that if you look at a Kala and she doesn't look pretty, you can't say that she's pretty. How can Beisilul say Kala Nova Chasuda? So the Rebbe's word is because when you look at the details, and especially if the details are inner details, Pnimius Dika details, there is something in her that makes her beautiful. The Haraya, the husband found her beautiful. So the outer, oila is more holy, should be worth more. But when you go into details, no, the fakir, the Korban Chagiga is broken down into details. Some has to go to the Mizbeach, some has to go to the Yidden. You need more meat. When you look at things in their details, Beisilul will look at it that way. Beishamai, the Rebbe writes, it has to do with the word sum. He evaluates, he gives one evaluation. He looks at a person and you are this or that. And Beisilul doesn't say just Chelek Eloka. Beisilul says you have many details. Some of them are great.
So how does that explain the difference here with the Re'iyah versus?
So therefore, since the Chagiga has two details, the Chagiga has to be more valuable. It has more pratim. Beisilul valued details. The fact that it had two achilas, that in itself makes it more valuable. And coming over here, the Rebbe says that we know that Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yaakov, Shamutehi, two meanings. One meaning is that he was from Talmidei Beishamai, not physically, but he followed that derech. So he, they looked at a person b'chlal. If you're a Poisha Yisrael, you're a Poisha Yisrael. But when you look at the Yid B'pnimiyos, and that's going to be the ending over here, even though it's Reish Lakish is following the concept of Beisilul. And even though on one hand he's called a Poisha Yisrael, but if you look, you'll find that he's Melei Mitzvahs Kerimain. If he's Melei Mitzvahs Kerimain, he can be a Poisha Yisrael, and Ein Oir Shel Gehenim will be Shailat Anim. However, with this, we make a Siyum on Chagiga, and God willing, and tomorrow morning, Shabbos Daf, and say the Moed. Tomorrow Shabbos learning never ends. Shabbos Daf Chai Mazel Tov.